it's a great pleasure to be here on your campus today. In particular, since I basically had a career that was headed to be a commercial banker in Utah, where I grew up, until I accidentally met a guy in the diving business that had a little company headquartered on Stearns Wharf in Santa Barbara. And he basically needed some venture capital, and I was just finishing working for Harvard Business School for 2 years as a case writer, and I said, oh, I can do that, not having the vaguest idea how I was going to do it. And anyway, as a result of that, I ended up spending the rest of my career in the energy business. And I can't imagine how having a more interesting career that by the time I was 25 or 26, I didn't have the vaguest idea what energy was all about. Last week, as I was in with my wife in Beijing, as they were launching the publication of Twilight in the Desert in Chinese, it was really a profound experience to meet with a variety of the senior energy planners in China, hear them talk about the fact that this translating team had apparently done the best job of translating a foreign book into Chinese that many people had ever seen. And they create a whole bunch of Mandarin characters that had never been created before. And so I want to say, if there's ever a really humbling experience, and then to be back here at sort of where I began my learning that energy was important is again an honor. We are facing some very challenging energy times, and there aren't enough people yet that are paying attention, but I got to tell you, I am really pleased to see the exponential growth in the interest in the subject and the people that are starting to take note. I do think we've got to be realistic about the fact that we could easily be basically facing an era when we are into an energy twilight. I didn't pick the term Twilight in the Desert. Actually, a friend of mine suggested that when I was groping for something to call this book on Saudi Arabia's oil. And as soon as I heard it, I thought, you know, twilight is really an interesting and kind of poignant term, because it doesn't mean, you know, the lights have gone out forever. It means we're in a transition. And I do think we are in a twilight transition, not just for Saudi Arabia's oil and the oil of the Middle East, but twilight as we've known modern energy. And I think the ability and how we understand that and comes to grips with it is going to have an enormous impact on whether the 21st century works, becomes a fabulous century, or whether it's the worst we've ever seen. Let me start out with some very basic stuff that really doesn't need to even be said, but I think it's an important starting place. Modern energy anchors virtually everything we do and how we live. And without it, almost everything we do and live stops. I think it's basically the true elixir of life. And what I mean by modern energy are sort of our four primary uses of energy. What we call petroleum basically creates transportation. 98% of transportation is oil-derived. Then out of oil also comes a strange ingredient we don't understand much about called natural gas liquids or wet gas or associated gas. And that basically becomes the building block for our petrochemical industry that becomes plastics and a whole litany of things. I bet if we could count all the stuff in this room that came from that, we'd all be surprised. Then we have methane, or what we casually call dry gas, natural gas. That turns out to be the only form of instantaneous and highly efficient heat the world's ever known. And then finally, we have fossil fuels, which include coal, natural gas, and oil, but primarily coal, nuclear, and renewables that create electricity. And the difference between electricity, natural gas liquids, and petroleum are profound. And yet, for some reason, we tend to kind of lump them all together and just call them energy. All those together make everything we cherish happen. And when an energy user lacks sufficient energy supply, which can happen as quickly as a blackout in electricity or as quickly as our gas lines happened in 1979, then everything comes to a standstill real fast. The top of energy security that's come high on the radar screen, finally probably too late, in a lot of different studies being done both in Europe and the United States and the United Kingdom and Asia, is basically an interesting term, or energy vulnerability, but I'll tell you it's a very regional issue. High-producing energy regions have, by definition, the highest energy security. Because producing energy at home is a lot better than producing energy someplace else. Low-energy users have negligible needs, and they often become also major energy producers. So they have very little energy security issues. There are a lot of villages still around the world, like about 3 billion people living in villages who barely use any modern energy at all. So they have a very different form of energy security issues than we do. So defining energy vulnerability turns out to be a very relative and very localized term. Regions with highest energy vulnerability tend to be regions with high energy use, or they tend to be regions with low energy production. regions that combine high energy use and low local supply move closer and closer to 100% at risk. Japan turns out to be a classic case study in the 1970s as the decade of the 70s began. Who basically built up a fabulous society. They didn't have any form of domestic energy, period, though. So they were highly vulnerable for the energy shock that happened in 1973. And if you look at the actions that Japan did for the next 2 decades, they did a remarkable job of not weaning themselves from energy, but putting a huge firewall between the sort of pure vulnerability they had. Then I come to the United States, and I say for years and years and years, the United States of America was both the world's highest energy producer. Amazing, for almost a century, we basically produced about 50% more oil than any other place on the earth, and we were also the highest energy user. The statistic you hear so often today is how does 5% of the people in the world use 25% of the world's energy? But what's missed in that is that we were also, for years, were one of the highest energy producers. But then as our supplies waned, our demand soared, and now by 2007, in a curiously accidental way, the United States has sort of become Japan circa 1970. You know, shrinking domestic energy supplies, at least we have some, but soaring energy use, so we're now the highest energy importer on Earth by a factor of about 3. The Wyoming State Geological Survey did an interesting study that I'd never seen these numbers put together before. What they basically did is measure the states that were basically the highest net exporters of energy, and then they measured the states that were the highest net importers of energy, and they called them energy parasites. The red states in this report, it's sort of hard to see the red states from the yellow, from the semi-red, turn out to basically be short in terms of the energy they use versus produce by 3 to 5 quads. Quads is a funny BTU term, but let me put 3 quads in perspective. It's the equivalent of 120 nuclear plants. It's the equivalent of 3 TCF of natural gas. It's the equivalent of 600 million barrels of oil or 1.5 million rail cars of coal. So it'll be 3 quads deficit is a big deal. What 4 states qualify? California, Iowa, New York, and Florida. What I find interesting on this is that Texas is in the next category of a energy parasite that's sort of not as, because I think most people who have been tested would say, oh, Texas must be one of our largest energy producers. What's even more interesting is this might be a little biased because it was prepared by the Wyoming State Geological Survey, but the single state in the United States with the single most total energy content to export turns out to be Wyoming. It's not a very obvious thing. And the next 3 big states are Alaska, not at all surprising, New Mexico, and West Virginia. But it's just so interesting to see how highly concentrated the U.S. is in a handful of states carrying the heavy water for most of the states that basically don't produce a lot of energy. I look at the Pacific Coast states and say there are very interesting energy profiles because as a region, they're all basically energy parasites. That sounds like a kind of a harsh word, but that was the term used in this report. California turns out, with the exclusion of Alaska, to be the only state in the Pacific Coast west of the Rocky Mountains that has that's a significant producer of oil, natural gas, hydropower, geothermal, but unfortunately its energy use is enormous, so it basically is a net energy importer. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and Arizona produce little energy. In fact, Washington State, with its hydro, is the only state of that list that produce any significant amount of energy at all. And so, unfortunately, all of these states have to rely on Alaska and foreign imports, and that would be fine if the Pacific Coast was basically the way it was 75, 80 years ago, but this is basically the largest regional population in the United States, and it still has very strong growth. And then you have the funny Rocky Mountains that basically create an energy wall that effectively isolates the West Coast from any significant amount of energy usage that's produced any place east of the Rocky Mountains. So it's a very different part of the United States. You can have energy sufficiency on the West Coast and problems elsewhere, or real problems on the West Coast that aren't addressed anyplace else. So it's probably our most vulnerable energy region. The parasite picture in a nutshell, I'm not going to belabor this, but for any of you that want to get a copy of the PowerPoints, they'll be posted on the website. They're just interesting to look at and see how concentrated in both coal and natural gas and crude oil and hydro and nuclear power and renewable our various states are. And the bottom line is that there are not a lot of states that basically are energy sufficient, big enough to be energy exporters. So we have even greater regional vulnerability than we have as a country. Then I look back on California and say, wow, what a rich history California has had in the energy business. There was a book that was published in 1924 by Upton Sinclair called Oil, O-I-L. It was reproduced by the California Historical Society about 10 years ago, and my wife gave me a copy to read about 4 years ago. It was fascinating to see this gifted writer, Upton Sinclair, telling the story of oil through the lens of the Los Angeles Basin oil boom. Biggest oil boom in the world was going on in the 20s in California. And I think most Americans would fill utterly on a quiz who was the biggest oil producer in the world in the 20s. It was the state of California. California's heavy oil resource is still enormous, but unfortunately it's heavy oil and very energy intensive. Drilling off California piers literally began the era of actually starting to tap oil in the waters. And then in Santa Barbara Basin, right here in your own backyard, we had the first generation of producing oil in deep water, when deep water was a term that meant about 200 feet. But out of that came all the breakthrough technology that led us to today to be able to kind of casually produce oil in 10,000-foot water depths, and it all started here. Geothermal energy was sort of invented in California, and most of the technology about geothermal energy still resides in this state. California was the only state for years to embrace the use of steam floods to start unlocking heavy oil. And California has large resources of natural gas, but maybe not as much as we think. So California basically has been a very important energy state for a long period of time and a real technology leader in energy. I'm not sure the state gets any credit for it. I'm not sure it basically thinks of itself that way. But in energy history, California really has mattered. Then just as California was sort of stepping to the sidelines, all of a sudden out of the blue, Alaska became the United States' last great energy king. It's interesting that oil was found in the Cook Inlet, I think sometime in the mid to late 50s. And for about a decade, the USGS cranked out computer models saying there was about maybe 10 to 15 billion barrels of usable oil in Alaska, but they thought it was the Cook Inlet. And then they found about 20 years later it actually wasn't the Cook Inlet at all. That was tiny. It was actually on the North Slope. And after almost a decade of very disappointing drilling success, on almost Christmas Eve, 1967, ARCO basically thought they found commercial presence of oil. And by the summer of 1968, the Prudhoe Bay oil field, the largest oil field in North America, was found, and that created the last frontier we've really ever had in America. By 1969, a lot of our best energy planners assumed that over the next decade we'd probably find as many as 4 or 5 more Prudhoe Bays, and that would keep us going for a long, long time as such a high energy king. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. Then basically we had another unbelievably important event that happened in 1969. In January 29th, 1969, we had basically a day of energy infamy. And basically that sort of became Black Friday for West Coast energy in a very accidental way. A blowout in the Santa Barbara Channel created the first significant offshore oil spill for drilling and producing oil in 22 years of offshore drilling any place in the world. Reaction to this tragedy led to Earth Day. It led to 35 years of drilling bans. It led to a 7-year delay in Prudhoe Bay's oil use. It was the beginning of the end of the USA's reign as a world energy king. But the good news is it also led to a revolution in highest quality blow-up prevention and a bunch of other technology things that probably might not have happened had we not had that spill. Then in 1970, we had another milestone event in the United States. Out of the blue, in December 1970, the USA, which didn't include Alaska at the time, that it was years away from coming on, peaked a little over 10 million barrels a day. For the previous century, the United States of America production outpaced every other country. We were basically, for almost that entire era, 50% higher energy producer than anybody else. Middle East was a tiny oil producer at the time. From the 1930s to 1969, U.S. oil was deemed to be so abundant that production restrictions dictated how much a state would allow its oil producers to flow. We wanted to prop up the price of U.S. oil so it wouldn't be swamped by cheap oil in the Middle East. In 1956, a senior scientist from Shell Oil Company, Dr. M. King Hubbard, at American Petroleum Geology meeting in San Antonio, much against the better advice of his senior executive at Shell, gave what's deemed today to be sort of an earthquake paper when he said from a lot of study, it would appear that by the early 1970s, the United States of America would peak as an oil producer and go into irreversible decline. By 1970, Dr. Hubbard, basically, his career had been in shatters. There were actually articles published saying, remember that old geezer back 20 years ago that said the U.S. was going to run out of oil? Look, we've never produced more the year we peaked. So we got it right to the date. But he was totally discredited by the time it happened. And unfortunately, it took the better part of a decade for people in the United States to look back with hindsight and say, isn't it amazing we actually peaked? Alaska turned out basically to never spawn another Prudhoe Bay. The Prudhoe Bay turned out to be Alaska's only supergiant oil field. We found about 5 other fields, but none were even 1/6 the size of Prudhoe Bay. Prudhoe Bay's maximum sustainable production was carefully set. They had about 7 years as they were litigating the pipeline to figure out at what rate can we produce that field so it produces the flattest amount possible till it goes into irreversible decline. They picked 1,500,000 barrels a day. They could have picked 3 million barrels a day. Prudhoe Bay would have been over in about 10 years. By picking that rate, they maintained flat production, steady as a rock for 11 to 12 years. But in the third quarter of 1989, Prudhoe Bay peaked, went into irreversible decline. And by the summer of 2006, when we had this stunning announcement that the Prudhoe Bay gathering system was rusting away, its output was already down to 400,000 barrels a day. So when you peak and starting to decline, the decline can happen pretty fast. Turns out that Alaska in total peaked at 2 million barrels a day when Prudhoe Bay was still 1.5 million barrels a day of that. So the other fields turned out to be 500,000 barrels a day. And by the time Prudhoe Bay had to temporarily shut down, all of Alaska was only producing 800,000 barrels a day. So Alaska, basically, its glory days are over, and we should be expecting Alaska's production to continue to fall. One issue that rarely ever gets addressed, even though it got addressed briefly when we're having these problems at Prudhoe Bay, at some point the oil production on the North Slope will likely fall to a level that it becomes virtually impossible to basically climb the Brooks Range. And so they'll have to start to batch it and shut the field down for a while and bring it up. And that's an issue that basically has been totally ignored in all of the sort of energy thinking in the United States. Then we had another awful event in the energy industry, the Valdez Oil Spill, that basically closed the door forever on future Alaska exploration. Good Friday 1989, a tanker went aground in Prince William Sound, caused a massive oil spill. The magnitude of the spill was several-fold worse than the Santa Barbara spill. In fact, the Santa Barbara spill, with the benefit of hindsight, was a relatively small oil spill. It was tragic that it happened, but in the grand scope of things, it was so tiny. The industry basically was almost positive for a month or two that luckily this was a tanker accident. It was a bad accident. It didn't have anything to do with drilling, so it shouldn't impact things. But it took about 3 months before basically we said that just proves that we should never drill for oil in Alaska. And so we basically just put one more nail in the sort of coffin of long-term sustainable supply on the West Coast for domestic energy. So the United States kind of created accidentally a de facto energy policy, and it started in 1970. It's alive and well as we go into the first month of 2007. Sort of do no harm, use cheap energy. The chain reaction to the Santa Barbara spill, to 3 Mile Island a few years later, to the Valdez spill, led to an increased offshore drilling bans, cessation of nuclear power. We then had an oil price collapse from 82 to 2002, and that led to unprecedented growth in U.S. energy use. So as energy supplies dwindled, energy demand soared, and imports filled the gap. And the West Coast turned out to lead both charges. It produced less and used more. And so of all the regions of the United States, it moved itself ever closer to this energy vulnerability of basically high use and low supply. So we accidentally steered the entire U.S. energy ship, but particularly the West Coast, into an accidental sunset. The unsung hero in all this was oilfield technology. Oil spills are still common, but they basically are all due to tanker accidents, some pipeline eruptions when an anchor chain drags along a pipeline. But according to the Ocean Commission, 63% of the 1.8 million barrels of oil a day that are spilled are seeps, or vents from the seafloor. Another 25% basically come from marine vessel related, we come from runoff. 5% from marine vessel, 2% from oil and gas operations. Of the 2% from oil and gas operations, 0.3% from a platform. The rest are basically all pipeline things that usually some vessel drags into a pipeline and causes a leak. So what we really did is close the loop on creating unbelievably safe energy to be produced, but I don't think the industry ever probably properly educated itself on that. But the one thing I will tell you is that blowout prevention technology today is actually dealing with pressures per pounds per square inch to a magnitude of maybe 10 times what we ever dreamed about in the 70s. And basically, for about 30 years, we have had effectively a perfect record, close to a perfect record of actually safely producing oil and gas from both onshore and offshore. Here's some numbers I just pulled out of the petroleum data book. These are Mineral Management Service numbers, so they're probably as good as you can get. Between 1971 and 1998, there were 168 events of blowouts. But in total, they basically spilled 999 barrels of oil. And over that same period of time, in the offshore, we produced 9.9 billion barrels of oil. That's about as good as you get on sort of safety records. I thought we just interested to step back and also maybe for my own edification, sort of look where California used to be as a total percentage of U.S. oil and where it is today. California, surprisingly enough, is still a very key oil producer in the United States. 1950, California, when the United States was producing 5 million barrels a day, and I think that was basically our consumption too, was 17% of our supply. It ironically has remained kind of in 11 to 12, 13% range ever since then. And actually, for a long period of time, its production held up a lot better than the rest of the United States, primarily because you had this anchor of heavy oil. And even today, this is using the 2004 numbers, I think 2006 are a little bit lower than this, you're still producing 65% of your peak output versus 56% of the United States. But if you took heavy oil out of that, I suspect those numbers would be way, way smaller. And California's heavy oil is, in my opinion, too energy and water intensive. If you go to the San Juan Basin and look how they actually generate the steam to unlock the heavy oil, you're talking about potable aquifer water and natural gas, both of which are possibly scarce resources. And so if someday we decide that's too valuable energy, then watch California's oil output plummet, because it's a heavy cost. So if this slips, then the West Coast has an enormous problem if Alaska continues to decline. So U.S. security, sort of over this period of time, became sort of seek diverse sources of non-local supply, and as long as you have enough diverse sources, you're going to be okay. And I guess the biggest mistake we made is for half a century, our core energy belief that we sort of then exported around the rest of the world was rooted in several untested concepts. The most important was that the Middle East has bountiful and cheap oil that will last for a lifetime or forever. And that's what everybody believed. We also believed that advancing technology was going to allow us to recover far more yet to be found oil and far more oil in place. And so many people said it's amazing we still only produce 20 or 30% of the oil that's in place, as if the rest was accident left behind. No, the rest is just very, very intensive to get out. And then the world has unlimited amounts of cheap oil and even cheaper natural gas. And out of that basically came sort of a mental blueprint that diversify your energy supply and all will be well, and the only thing that will bite you is geopolitical turmoil. Well, it turns out, after a lot of research, I'd convinced myself enough to write this book, Twilight in the Desert, that our energy dream turned out to be a myth. There was never a scrap of solid data backing up the thesis that there was oil every place in the Middle East and it was free to produce. It turns out, with the benefit of hindsight, less than 40 giant or supergiant oil fields were ever found in the Middle East. If you take all of them together and start with this top of this pyramid, that's Kirkuk at the top of Iraq, and you come down the eastern side and you're covering about 40 miles to the eastern edge of the Persian Gulf, all the great oil fields of Iran. You come down to the bottom of the Gulf and come across, you get the UAE, you come back up and get all the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. That golden triangle, if you put the bottom base along the Arizona border, would basically go about 2/3 into Utah and cover less than the western half of Arizona and Utah, and it covers all the oil ever produced. If you draw a ring road around Saudi Arabia's most prolific light oil, which is North Ghawar, Abqaiq, and Berry, and move that ring road into the Great Salt Lake, that's where I grew up, it would fit basically within the bottom part of the Great Salt Lake. So Middle East oil was actually dispersed in a very handful of places. And yet we believed for 50 years it was every place. The last few discoveries of any great size ended between 1965 and 1972, and so what we ended up in the Middle East was too many giant eggs from a tiny basket, but we basically just didn't have the intellectual curiosity to figure that out. Saudi Arabia's oil system in reality is old and fragile. For 6 decades, 3 great supergiant oil fields created the world's most prolific oil, and the oil was light but sour. Turns out that North Gawar, which is the world's largest oil field, but it's only about the top 25 to 30 mile world's largest oil field, Abqaiq and Berry basically produced about 80% of all of Saudi Arabia's oil when they were at peak production of over 10 million barrels a day. They probably still account for 70% of Saudi Arabia's oil. And then in the 50s and 60s, basically, you had 3 offshore fields come on stream that produced all of Saudi Arabia's heavy oil. And it's Safaniya, Zuluf, and Marjan. So these basically 6 fields effectively produced about 90-95% of all Saudi Arabia's oil, but we just assumed that oil was every place in Saudi Arabia. The last 2 great discoveries were Shaiba and Hatta. Shaiba was basically discovered in 1968. It's in the empty quarter. It's the only significant production ever found in the empty quarter. Hatta was discovered in 1989 in Central Arabia. When I was visiting Saudi Arabia early in 1993, I couldn't believe how excited everyone was about this Hatta field because it produced 200,000 barrels a day. Well, when I started reading the technical papers, it's the only significant oil ever found of commercial content outside the eastern province in this one field in the empty quarter. And it basically peaked 10 years later with 5 satellite fields at 200,000 barrels a day. They basically have not found another significant oil field since then, and they've looked and they've looked and they've looked. There are some 90 other fields that are listed officially by the Petroleum Ministry of Saudi Arabia and in Saudi Aramco's annual report as discovered oil and gas fields, but even though they're in the middle of a record spending to rehabilitate old fields, not a single one of those 90 fields seems to have any plans to ever be brought into commercial. I suspect they basically were shows and non-commercial hydrocarbon. We're finally starting to get a bit of visibility out of some of the other Middle East producers that they all have aging assets. About a year ago Thanksgiving, the chairman of the board of Kuwait Petroleum announced one day that the Burgan field, which is the largest producing field in Kuwait and which accounted for about 75-80% of Kuwait's production, had basically been at 2 million barrels a day for 6 decades and was exhausted. That was the quote. And that Burgan now needs to start reducing its oil output. I believe they've taken it down to about 1.6 million or 1.7 million, and hopefully at that lower rate it can continue to produce safely. Iran's oil minister, about a month and a half ago, announced that Iran is in desperate need for massive new investment, and without this new investment, it's going to be very difficult to replace the oil field declines at its mature fields that are now declining at a rate of 13% per annum. That's a number that had never been in public domain before. There was a recent study done about 4 weeks ago by a team of people at Johns Hopkins that looked at the population growth in Iran and basically the maturing of their oil fields and said there's a fair likelihood that by 2014 Iran will stop exporting oil, period. They'll need it all themselves. So the Middle East turns out to be a very different area than we all thought. Saudi Arabia right now is racing to recreate spare capacity. Capital spending at Saudi Aramco is at record levels. In September of 2006, they announced that in just their exploration and development program in 2007, it would be about $2.4 billion. By December, the budget had grown by 60% to $4 billion. They're planning 500 high-technology wells being drilled in 2007 versus an average of about 200 2 or 3 years ago. All these projects are basically in old problem fields that were discovered in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Kharayas, Kursanaya, Abba Hydra, and Fadili. None of those are new fields. None of them are easy fields. They're all very complicated programs. And when these are done, they have one more announcement that they're going to proceed ahead in 2008 on Marjan, which is their heaviest oil field that's never had any production. And after that, they're effectively saying that's the end of our program. There's nothing more to do unless they find something. So things aren't quite as rosy in Saudi Arabia as we all were led to believe for so many years. And when it's clear that Saudi Arabia's oil peaks, and then it's clear that the Middle East has peaked, because there has never been any country in the Middle East that ever could pretend it could start to make up for declines in Saudi Arabia. And once that day is clearly here, then in my opinion, it's clear as a bell that the world is peaking. Decline rates are increasing throughout the world through technology gains. It turned out all this fabulous oil field technology that was beamed by so many people to create the ability to find oil easier and produce oil faster was effectively creating just-in-time supply by bringing it out of the ground faster. And we basically created decline curves that were just technically impossible to even do 30 years ago. And too many of our key countries have peaked. I just pulled because they were easy numbers to get a handful of publicly available numbers. Here's Australia, who peaked about 750,000 barrels a day in 2000, and by 2005 they're down to about 450. Colombia was 800,000 barrels a day. It's now 500,000 barrels a day. The North Sea was deemed by all the smart operators in the North Sea not to peak until about 2010. 1995, I spent less than 5 hours looking at the field-by-field production statistics and said it would seem to me, in an address I gave in Aberdeen, that the likelihood is extremely high that by between 1998 and 2000, the North Sea is going to peak. It peaked in 1999, UK and Norway at 6.1 million barrels a day. Now the best experts think that by about 2009, the North Sea will be down to basically 3 million barrels a day. So it lost half in a decade. How many countries are past peak? Here's an interesting list that comes from one of the better databases around. And some of these countries are producing so little it's irrelevant, and some actually were very large energy producers. But the interesting thing is that you can now statistically count on individual countries, far more than 50% of the companies that ever produced oil in total number of countries that are now past peak. When oil peaks, it doesn't tend to basically stay at a plateau for very long. Here's a production profile of the United States of America, including the oil we added from Alaska, including the oil which you see in the sort of first blue string, including the oil we added from Deepwater Gulf of Mexico. What I find interesting about this is the 10 million peak level, or about 11.5 million when you add natural gas liquids, we said in 1970, had nothing to do with Deepwater. It had nothing to do with Alaska. Alaska could have been Russia. Deepwater could have been Mexico. If you look at the remaining base that peaked at 10 million barrels a day, it's down to 3. And if you take out stripper well production, which are wells that are producing about, on average, 2.2 barrels a day of oil and between 100 and 500 barrels a day of brine, you're basically down to about 2.2. So that's in 30 years. So when peak happens, even with all this modern technology, you come down the other end of the curve pretty fast. This just happened to be some numbers from Egypt showing the same pattern. They peaked in discovery. 30 years later, they peaked in their oil output. The UK peaked in discoveries in the 70s. 30 years later, they peak in their output. They're in free fall decline. The United Kingdom this year, for the first time in 30 years, became a net importer of oil. So the world's output of oil is showing a lot of signs of nearing its sustained peak output, unless you can go back and get comfortable with the concept that the Middle East had boundless oil, and I will tell you there was never any data to support that. They might find boundless oil somehow, but it's been too long now for us to keep banking on that. And the few oil producers with clear growth turn out to be countries like Angola, Brazil, maybe Kazakhstan, Chad, Sudan, but all of them individually are so small that they could double or triple their oil output, which would be very hard to do, and it hardly makes up for the risk in Mexico, for instance, of the Cantarell field, which is now the second largest oil-producing field in the world that has finished tertiary recovery. It peaked at 2.2 million barrels a day about a year and a half ago. It's down to about 1.7 million today. And some of the experts within PMEX are worried that by about 2010, it'll be down to about 600,000 barrels a day. If that happens, about halfway down, Mexico becomes impossible to basically export oil to the United States of America. And that will be an enormous day in the history of America. So the era of increasing oil imports at low prices is over. It probably never should have happened. It was an illusion, but it's over. Meanwhile, that wouldn't be so bad if we'd been prepared for this and developed a world that was basically starting to reduce its energy intensity, but we never did that. Turns out that the demand for oil and supply don't know each other. They're very different forces. These happen to be the numbers that are sort of the latest projections out of the International Energy Agency in Paris for total energy demand by source going out to 2030. And if you look at these numbers and sort of calipers out, they assume that oil consumption will grow by another 50% by 2030. They assume that natural gas and coal consumption will grow by over 90% each by 2030. As big as these numbers are, if you pick them apart and look at what they basically are assuming happens to India and China, they're still about half of Mexico's per capita oil consumption by 2030. One number that I think is bona fidely terrifying is Mexico turns out to be a very small user of oil per capita. It's about 6.5 barrels per person a year compared to 25 in the United States. If you froze the population of India and China today, and took them up over some period of time to the energy consumption per capita of Mexico, the world would need another 44.5 million barrels a day. The likelihood of supplying that is zero. And so what we've got to do is figure out a way fast to basically start putting some form of supply constraints so we don't have a clash of civilization as we have the poor countries who basically on our watch we used up their oil. Is an energy crisis approaching, or is an energy crisis already here? I think the nub of the problem is oil and gas supply is too old and too much in decline, and energy demand is too young and has now become effectively a runaway train. I was interested in China last week to use the term a runaway train and find out that that's an idiom that they don't kind of have any use for in China, and I was trying to describe what a runaway train means. It basically means that until you get to the bottom of the hill, you can't stop it. You can put another train in front of it, it just goes right through it. So we've really got to deal with this issue. How do we basically control energy demand? Because it doesn't understand supply. Energy reality is pretty simple. Energy demand is a term that means this is what we wanted. Energy use can never exceed supply. It can temporarily while we use up the last amounts of what we have in inventory, and then we actually have shortages. It's physical reality one-on-one. So it's time to start to fight our energy war, and what that means is we need to pull out all stops on what we can do on new supplies. And unfortunately, I don't believe there's a lot we can do on new supplies that will even start to get us out of the box. But if we basically say, well, why even worry about it, then we compound our problem enormously. And so there is no supply too small to basically not make a difference, because they're basically bridges to buy us time while we do some very massive changes. We need to begin immediately a swift and massive and effective oil conservation effort that I'll address in a minute. We need to invest amounts of money we've never even thought about before in trying to invent some new energy sources that work in scale, and probably move away from too much R&D that's being done today on some alternative energies that are just realistically too energy intensive to actually start really addressing the problem, or work fine for a village but don't scale up to even a large county. Are there any new supply frontiers left? You know, we'll never know that until we've actually explored every basin in the world, but I think onshore it's pretty easy to say the last great onshore field we've discovered of any size was basically 45 years ago. And they're pretty easy to find because you can see the anticline or whatever geological form sticking out of the earth. In the offshore, we might still have a lot in the offshore, in the deep water basins of the world, but we have such a shortage of deep water rigs, it'll take a long, long period of time to have the rigs to basically do even a bare penetration of the coastline of deep water off Africa, for instance. Arctic oil has a lot of promise, and a lot of the energy planners, the USGS continues to say, oh, Arctic oil will basically be the last great frontier. But there's some pretty realistic studies being done today that say it would appear that most of the energy that we might find in the Arctic is probably natural gas, and that's real complicated to bring out. Oil's real complicated to bring out. So I'm not sure, ironically, that the only low-hanging fruit of realistic new frontier is of virgin territory turns out to be the outer continental shelf of North America. And it's ironic to me that in the outer continental shelf of North America, we basically have about 95% of all the wells we've ever drilled that are bunched into the central and western part of the Gulf of Mexico, over 50,000 wells. We have a clump of wells that have been drilled in Campeche Bay. We have a clump of wells that have been drilled in the Maritimes. We have a clump of wells in the Cook Inlet, and then a clump of wells in the Santa Barbara Basin, and basically that's it. If you exclude the wells that we've drilled in the Maritimes off Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, the number of well penetrations in the entire Atlantic seacoast is about 50 to 60 well bores over 40 years. So we don't have any idea whether we have anything there or not. And unless you drill, you don't have to produce, but unless you drill, we won't have any idea what our local inventory might be. And I think it's time to basically sort of wake up and say the risk of not doing that outweighs the risk of doing it by maybe a measure of 1,000,000 to 1. Then we have another interesting question. Have we run out the clock on new supplies, even if there is some there? What I worry about a lot is that our worldwide drilling fleet is too small and too old. We have about 600 workable offshore rigs in the world, all around the world, and in 2007, on average, those rigs will be 25 years old. We happen to spend the summer in Maine, and we have a lobster boat that was built in 1986. We bought it in 92. We have it in the water about 90 to 100 hours in the summer. We take it out in the fall. We try to have it put back to be just as new. And this year we had to redo the paint. I saw the pictures at Christmas time of what the core inside of our lobster boat looked like. It was unbelievable. It was almost rusted away. So I say, I can't imagine if we did an MRI on the average offshore rig in the world that's 25 years old, what awful shape it must be in. And yet we're now locked in to having to keep those rigs working because basically it would take a decade or two to start replacing our rig fleet. So even if we basically opened up all this access, the question becomes, how do you have the drilling assets to be employed? We have a handful of deep water rigs, about 100 great deep water rigs. The average cost turned out to be about $400 million each. We probably needed 800 to 1,000. I suspect now that we're starting to build another 30 deep water rigs, that by the time we get those 30 done, the average cost is going to average close to $1 billion a unit, take about 4 years per rig. So adding drilling equipment is not an easy task. And in the background, you have a problem that's probably more serious than a rig limitation. Our skilled oil field workers are basically all retiring en masse, and we went 25 years effectively without adding new people. And the handful of new people we added too often got fired the next time we had a price collapse. So we basically have a generation gap of skilled oil field workers. You talk to anybody at Schlumberger or Halliburton or Baker Hughes or any of the drilling contractors and say, realistically, how long does it take to train a skilled drilling hand to use this ultra-modern drilling equipment? And the answer is between a decade and a decade and a half. At MD Anderson, they can train brain surgeons probably faster than we can train geosteering experts. So we have a lot of catch-up to do as we try to basically replace all these aging assets and recruit a new generation. This is probably actually where China comes to the forefront, because the one thing China has is real smart people. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we find that just like what happened when we basically allowed the Southern Pacific Railroad to figure out how to get up over the Sierra Nevadas, it's maybe the skilled workers of China coming to the United States to help us address some of our problems. But basically, this physical constraint is not going to be easy to address. It's going to take a lot of time. And it does raise the issue, have we basically just run the clock out, even if we could find more? So I think basically the world needs to take this extremely seriously and go as quickly as possible to what I would call an energy war footing. If you go back to history and you look at where we were in 1939, we sailed through the summer of 1939 fat, dumb, and happy. We were still arguing with each other about how stupid it was to think that Germany would ever have military intent. And then they invaded Poland, and within a week we were at war. But ironically, it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that America realized we were at war, so the war had been going on almost 2 years. But out of the blue, the United States, Canada, the UK created a war machine from nothing in basically between 39 and the end of 45, and it was so powerful it basically leveled Europe and Japan. If we take that same intensity on our energy problems, or like we did in the Marshall Plan, I think we can actually figure this thing out. The first thing we desperately need to do, and this sounds like a paperwork sort of thing, I can't tell you how important this is. We need to have a mandated field-by-field production report by at least the top 200 producing oil fields in the world. They all internally have this data. Nobody wants to share it. And basically some sort of internal tribunal will need to say, you produce the data, and if you don't, we're going to basically fine you on the point of export. And then I bet you in about 6 months you're going to find everybody producing the data, because it's not confidential. It's just basically data they feel more comfortable holding in their chest. With that data, you could blow through all the arguments that get clouded up in remaining proven reserves. It's such fuzzy data today and start actually profiling the production profiles of the top 200 fields. It would take about a week, and if we find that over 50% are in irreversible decline, then we will know categorically that the world has actually passed sustainable peak oil production. We need to do that even worse in natural gas, because I worry a lot more about natural gas peaking actually than I do oil, because I think it's going to be hard to figure out. And so while we're doing that, we prove up the issue, and then we pull all stops on creating safe, clean energy supply, but we have to be brutally realistic. The stops aren't going to get us out of the box, but if we don't pull out all stops, we deepen the hole. In the meantime, we need to take a deep breath and in a very short period of time go through one of the biggest transitions the world's ever seen. We need to make massive changes in how we inefficiently use oil and gas. Oil turns out to be a transportation fuel. If you strip out the natural gas liquids, which is the petrochemicals, virtually all the rest of oil creates transportation energy. It's gasoline, it's diesel fuel, it's jet fuel, it's bunker fuel for ships. And so the biggest solution is we travel less. And the way we start out at that, in my opinion, is the easiest thing in the world to do is we break the old rules that have been around for centuries of to keep a good job, you have to show up at work. And we start paying by productivity and letting people work where they want, when they want, and if they're productive, we pay them more. And I suspect we have all the tools we need today to make that happen. It turns out that's going to be the historical benefit of email and webcams and cell phones and so forth. And within 3 or 4 years, we could actually find, if we change the paper, we could effectively almost end long-distance commuting for a high percentage of people that go to work unhappy. They get home unhappy because they're wasting an enormous amount of time each day stuck in traffic. We need to then be very careful about how we ship goods and people over long distances. We probably actually, in the business travel, I suspect that about maybe 2/3 of the travel today could be replaced by webcam if we just got used mentally to doing that. At MD Anderson in Houston, one of the great cancer research institutes, they have brain surgeons that are conducting brain surgery in India through webcam. See, if that can happen in brain surgery, you can actually have some real important meetings by using this fabulous technology. We need to basically take careful note of how we ship goods coming from China, for instance, to the West Coast, because all the goods coming from China that go to Walmart and Home Depot and every place else all arrive at the West Coast. Every one of our ports are so congested today. And then they primarily get on trucks. And the trucks, in the most cumbersome sort of way, start lumbering across the United States, getting 3 to 6 miles per gallon. And so while we're so preoccupied with the SUV, it's not the problem. You get 6 people in an SUV and it becomes sort of an inefficient unit. The trucks over long distances are the single biggest energy waste we do. If we basically reorganized all of that and put the goods on barges and used our water system, we might have to widen the Panama Canal or create a light rail system. You can basically get goods apparently over water in about 25 days between any of the ports on the West Coast and basically assuming some congestion in the Panama Canal to any place on the East Coast. And by doing that and eliminating the long-distance trucking, you have an energy savings of maybe up to 30-fold, kind of depending on the efficiency of the vessel. And then we need to use light rail to get the goods as close to some sort of a hub, so we start using trucks the way FedEx does for short-haul delivery. These are things that aren't just nice to think about doing. They're things we're going to have to do because we're going to have to get along with less. We need to take very careful attention to our food supply. In the course of the time since I was in high school, or I think college, which was kind of 40, 45 years, we basically went from seeing fresh produce in the summer to now going to a grocery store almost any place in the world and seeing fresh produce from all over the world, from all around the world. One of the most absurd examples, in my opinion, is go to a supermarket in Maine in July, and they're blueberries from Chile. They've traveled 5,000 miles. They don't taste anything. They're actually ornamental food. And the refrigeration, which is unbelievably energy-intensive, and the energy use, was an interesting article in the New York Times Science magazine right at the end of last year about the global shipping fleet, or fishing fleet, and how high energy prices are just killing the fishing fleet now that they're having to go out into the middle of the ocean to catch fish since we've kind of depleted the shallow water fishing stock. And the article claimed that the fishing fleet globally in 2005 used more oil than the Netherlands did. And the Netherlands are the 17th largest oil consumer on earth. We have to stop that. We need to basically grow stuff at home and learn how to bottle and can again because we just are wasting too much energy. And then sooner or later, we need to go back and take a deep breath and re-examine what we casually call globalization. And I don't mean people talking to each other. I mean the concept that you take a manufactured part and you break it into its smallest component and search the world for a sweatshop economy where there's somebody that's willing to work for 50 cents a day. And then you totally ignore the energy intensity of zinging that part around the world to finally where you have an assembled car. We basically, the flaw of that was two things. The energy would be so cheap it didn't need to be counted, and also the guy working for 50 cents a day was going to be happy with that. Go any place in the world, they don't want to stay at 50 cents a day. They were aspiring to $10 an hour, so it was just a phony plan. And the quicker we can get over that and start building things closer to where they're used, the better we're going to start basically getting into energy efficiency that really works fast. We need to do a Manhattan-style project for energy R&D. It took about 10 years to basically create the Manhattan Project that laid the foundation for nuclear energy and nuclear bombs. And most of that, ironically, was funded by a guy named Alfred Lee Loomis in Tuxedo Park out of his checkbook. And so I think that if we can do that sort of stuff in the 30s, we can actually go on a launching of R&D in a profound way. We need to take careful attention to the fact that energy prices are still unbelievably cheap. Too many people think that $75 oil or $65 oil is really expensive, and I keep saying $65 a barrel is 10 cents a cup. And most consumer things we buy, we pay for by the cup. In China, I couldn't find anyone that knew anything you could buy anymore for less than $1 a cup, except refineries, what they pay for oil. So in the future, we need to pay a fair price for energy, which means prices are going to go way up. And if we use those high energy prices and the wellhead river and it creates wisely, it can basically have an enormous role to play in making our world more sustainable. One of the biggest risks we face in our energy supply is not just decline at the wellhead, it's the fact that our entire delivery system that allows us to casually use 85 million barrels a day of oil and another 50 million barrels a day equivalent of natural gas is largely beyond its original design life and largely rusting away. And I can't imagine that over the next 10 or 15 years it's going to do anything but collapse. So over this period of time, we need to do the biggest construction project the world's ever done and totally rebuild the system. And the blue-collar boom that will create in fabulous jobs will actually sustain the economy through a far higher era of energy prices. And then we need to sit down with the leaders of the OPEC nations and tell these guys, this is your last chance before the train leaves Dodge City. The OPEC nations used to be, in 1980, collectively 330 million people. In 1990, they were 440 million people. In 2000, they were 550 million people. By 2010, there'll be about 700 million people. About 2% are ultra-rich and 98% are ultra-poor. If they use this era of high energy prices to quickly build a sustainable middle class, we will create the greatest explosion of purchases of goods that the OECD sell. And in addition, in my opinion, you go to the Middle East today to the few areas of prosperity, and it's basically Abu Dhabi, Dubai, to a lesser extent Kuwait City, Doha. There is nothing unstable about those areas. It's like going to Singapore 30 years ago. So you create a sustainable middle class in the Middle East, and we might actually finally eradicate terrorism to boot, just as a special benefit. So I think basically it's time for a clarion call for a new era of energy enlightenment. For 50 years, we made some of the most egregious mistakes ever. One of the most interesting op-ed pieces that I've ever produced, I actually did a year ago last summer, and my co-author was the Honorable Stuart Udall, who was a distinguished Secretary of Interior during the Kennedy-Johnson years. And Stuart Udall's nephew suggested to both his uncle and me that we actually tackle this paper together. And while we've never met, we've become, we talk often by email. It had the perspective of the fact that 50 years ago he entered the United States Congress. And so he could go back and look at the energy mistakes we made during the Eisenhower years and the Kennedy years and the Johnson years, and I could sort of take over when I started my energy education. And what we basically concluded is through 8 presidencies and 25 administrations, we screwed up. So anytime someone gets partisan and said, oh, if it weren't for the X administration, we wouldn't have these problems, I'd go back and say, no, it actually goes back 50 years. It was everybody. So this is a totally bipartisan screw-up. So it turns out that we basically ended up in a nutshell using too much, paying too little, and letting the system get too old. And in a nutshell, that's the nub of our problem. And so leadership into this new era begins at home. But guess what? Home isn't our home or our village. Home is basically the world, because the United States, China, Russia, Europe, we all need to get together and work out a plan to solve this problem, because individually it basically won't make a big enough difference. We need to get the universities involved. We need to get the churches involved. We need to get all the stakeholders in the challenge. Who are all the stakeholders? They're all of us, because everybody in the world gets squashed if this thing doesn't work. So I think basically it's time for the big wake-up call from our energy dream. For 50 years, the world blissfully dreamed that energy was an endowed, virtually free gift. We wasted a vast amount of our highest quality energy at low prices. We flared the best natural gas we'll ever have. We just burned it in the atmosphere. We built a global blueprint that assume the energy use could expand forever and the dream is over, the alarm's gone off, it's time to wake up. Thank you.